What if hell was never part of the divine plan, but rather a human strategy? For centuries, we believed hell was a place prepared by God for sinners. But what if that idea wasn't heavenly at all? What if it was political? Eternal fire, endless torture, the screams of the damned. None of these appear in Genesis, not in Exodus, not in the early writings of Moses. So, what changed? In the early days of Christianity, the first followers of Jesus didn't speak of hell. They spoke of Sheol, the realm of the dead, a silent, gray place without judgment or punishment. So who lit the fires of hell? In the 5th century, the empire collapsed. The church's authority rose, and with it came fear. Hell was redesigned, not as a warning, but as a weapon. An invisible prison with very real consequences. Why did hell emerge just as the church's power was being threatened? And why did Lucifer, barely mentioned in ancient texts, become the ruler of this new kingdom of terror? The first references to eternal fire appear in the writings of the Church Fathers, men who blended Greek philosophy, apocalyptic fear, and ambitions of control. They didn't just want believers, they wanted obedience. Penance became currency, fear became a tool, hell became the most effective invisible prison in history. And Lucifer, he was transformed from bearer of light to jailer of souls. A symbol sculpted to give fear a face, a myth rewritten to justify suffering. But what do the original texts really say about him? In the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, Lucifer isn't even called that. The word Lucifer appears only once, in the Latin Vulgate, as a poetic translation of morning star. It didn't refer to a fallen angel, but to a human king, a man. So why did he become the eternal enemy? Why was hell placed in his hands? Maybe the answer lies in the councils, the hidden chambers of faith, the rooms where the Bible was edited, trimmed and censored. Hell as we know it wasn't revealed by God. It was designed by men, and its architecture bears the marks of Rome, not Eden. Who benefits when everyone fears what happens after death? And what had to be erased so fear could become doctrine? The fire that burns forever may not be beneath the earth, but inside the stories that taught us never to question. So the real question is, what if hell isn't a place, but an idea, a mechanism, an invisible prison built in the dark ages to make sure you never rebelled? And Lucifer, maybe he didn't create hell, but perhaps he was the first soul to burn in it. Not by divine fire, but by the lies of men. What do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What if the devil wasn't discovered, but manufactured? In the beginning, there was no devil, no pitchfork, no horns, no fiery throne. There was only a shadowy figure, buried between the lines of the Old Testament, a Satan, lowercase, not a proper name, just a title. It meant accuser or adversary. Sometimes he served God, other times he tested humans. There was no great rebellion, no infernal kingdom, just ambiguity. But in the silence left by the sacred texts, fear found fertile ground. In the early centuries, theologians and monks began stitching fragments together, blending Isaiah with Ezekiel, turning Lucifer into the fallen angel. It was an interpretation, not a revelation. So who decided he was the eternal enemy? The answer lies in the shadows of the 4th century, in Nicaea, where councils shaped not only faith, but control. Lucifer was pulled from obscure verses and reshaped into the ultimate symbol of evil. Why? Because evil needed a face, and sin needed a keeper. Without an absolute enemy, total obedience is impossible. Without hell burning in the background, heaven loses its power. By the Middle Ages, the drama of salvation needed 2 lead roles, the Savior and the Tempter. That's when the devil was born, not from heaven, not from the abyss, but from the ink of men who wanted to rule souls. What if Lucifer didn't fall, but was pushed out of doctrinal necessity? In sacred art, he became monstrous. In sermons, his name was whispered with dread. In monastic schools, he became mandatory study, the study of the enemy. But in the apocryphal texts, his story looked very different. In the Book of Enoch, Lucifer isn't the commander of evil, but a reflection of other angels, the Watchers, who disobeyed out of love for humanity. Rebels, yes, but moved by compassion. What if Lucifer shared that same pain? Why were the apocryphal texts rejected? What truths did they contain that so deeply threatened the official narrative? They showed a divided heaven, a God who debated with his angels, a flawed creation filled with beings who didn't fit into the mold of perfect good. Maybe Lucifer was never evil, just necessary. The shadow required so that control could shine as light. If evil must be absolute, then obedience must be total. And that's how the devil was invented. With images, with sermons, with fear, not to free souls, but to bind them, not in the darkness of the underworld, but in the darkness of ignorance. After all, why would a God of love need an eternal executioner? If this message resonated with you, like this video and help spread the word. What if the hell you fear was imagined by a poet? For centuries, our collective vision of hell didn't come from the Bible, but from a literary work. In 1320, Dante Alighieri completed The Divine Comedy, a poetic masterpiece, written in verse, describing his journey through three realms, hell, purgatory, and paradise. It was fiction, but treated as revelation. Dante divided hell into 9 circles, each one reserved for a specific sin. The lustful, swept away by endless winds. The heretics, burning in fiery tombs. The traitors, frozen in eternal ice. A symbolic, artistic, and terrifying vision of the afterlife. But here's what few people talk about. Dante didn't draw inspiration from the Gospels. He borrowed from Greco-Roman mythology. The imagery of hell, fire, monsters, screams, torture had already existed in the myths of Hades, in the punishments of the Titans, and in the writings of Virgil and Ovid. What Dante did was mix those legends with Catholic dogma and the politics of his own time. The result? A vision of hell so vivid, it became more influential than scripture itself. Why have we placed more faith in the fantasy of one man than in the words of Christ, who barely spoke of hell at all? And why did the church embrace this theatrical vision, despite knowing it was symbolic? Because it worked. Because it created order. Because it turned poetry into doctrine and fear into faith. Thanks to Dante, hell gained geography. It gained rules. It gained logic. It became a believable place. And worse, an inevitable one for anyone who dared to question. And Lucifer, Dante placed him in the 9th and final circle, frozen in ice, with 3 mouths chewing Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. A punishment not for betraying God, or being, but for betraying power. Why is Lucifer frozen, not burning? Because in Dante's symbolism, ice represents the total absence of divine love. But what if that absence was a human invention? The hell we know today was shaped more by artists than by prophets, more by poets than by saints, and yet it was canonized in sermons. Why? Because fear needs images, and Dante gave us the most powerful one of all. So now the question is, has the entire structure of hell been a theater we've performed for centuries, never realizing the script was written by men, not gods? Subscribe. What comes next is even darker. What if hell wasn't revealed, but voted into existence? Very few people talk about how the Bible was assembled, how it was chosen, how it was edited, and most importantly, how it was censored. In the 4th century, church leaders gathered to decide what would be considered divine and what would be condemned as heresy. Behind the closed doors of the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, and Carthage, books were banned. Passages were altered, interpretations were erased. The goal? To build a single theology, an unquestionable doctrine, a convenient narrative. Hell, until then a vague and scattered concept, was finally given shape. But not through divine revelation, through political consensus. Who decides the eternal fate of souls? By vote. And who benefits when fear becomes the official language of faith? In the apocryphal Gospels, the ones banned from those councils, we find radically different visions of the afterlife. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus never even mentions hell. In the Gospel of Philip, the focus is on self-knowledge, not punishment. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, Lucifer isn't even mentioned. Why were these views silenced? Because they offered freedom. Because they invited questions. Because they removed the invisible whip of guilt. Instead of a God who punishes with eternal fire, these texts speak of a creator who calls us to awareness. And that was far too dangerous for a church that wanted control, not just over bodies and minds, but over souls. Hell as we know it didn't come from heaven. It was enforced on earth, not by prophets, but by emperors, bishops, and sacred editors. When Constantine converted to Christianity, he wasn't seeking salvation. He was seeking control. He needed a unified faith powerful enough to hold together a fractured empire. Hell was useful, Lucifer necessary, not as a spiritual being, but as a symbol, a warning for anyone who dared to resist. The narrative was stitched together and imposed. So now, the question isn't whether hell exists. The question is, what else was erased to make hell make sense? Share this with someone who needs to see what was hidden. What if the most feared place in Christian faith was plagiarized from ancient religions? Long before the Bible was compiled, civilizations were already speaking of underworlds. Hades in Greece, Duat in Egypt, hell among the Norse, shadowy realms where souls face trials, but rarely eternal damnation. The idea of endless punishment, unceasing pain, eternal flames, didn't originate in Jerusalem. It was born in myth. In ancient Greece, Tartarus was reserved for the Titans and those who betrayed the gods. A dark, damp place filled with sorrow, a prison for the rebels of heaven. Sound familiar? In Egyptian mythology, the hearts of the dead were weighed on a scale. Judgment was fair, punishment was proportional. There was no concept of eternal torture. So why did the Christian hell become so radical? Because it wasn't just inspired, it was remodeled. At the height of the Middle Ages, the church borrowed symbolic elements from these pagan underworlds. The fire, the monsters, the punishments, and dressed them in Christian dogma. But with one fatal addition, eternity. No return, no redemption. Christian hell was sealed, and the key was thrown away. Who turned spiritual symbols into a life sentence for the soul? Why was this new version of suffering so convenient for the power structure of the time? The climax of this revelation is simple and devastating. Hell wasn't created to punish sinners, but to silence questioners. They copied the imagery of the pagans, amplified the fear, and then declared, "This is the word of God." But God, was he ever asked? Have you ever wondered about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. What if the greatest enemy of faith is actually the missing piece to understanding it? When we dive into the texts rejected by the church, a figure begins to emerge, not as the devil, but as a symbol. A bearer of light, a being who challenges, not out of pride, but out of awareness. The name Lucifer appears only once in the Bible, Isaiah 14:12, and even then, not as a proper name. The Latin Lucifer was a translation of the Hebrew word Halel, meaning morning star. And the verse wasn't about a fallen angel, but a mortal king. So how did this name become synonymous with Satan? In the centuries that followed, theologians reinterpreted the verse and stitched together forced connections. Lucifer became the fallen angel, God's rival, the king of hell. But the text never said that. They never did. Why did the church need such a powerful villain? And what did it gain by turning a symbol of light into the Lord of darkness? The answer lies in the shadows of medieval theology, a time when doubt was sin, thought was dangerous, and questioning was heresy. And heresy needed a face. Lucifer became that face, the mirror of all resistance. But in the Gnostic manuscripts he appears differently, not as evil, but as the knower, the one who challenges the oppressive god of the material world. A symbol of liberation, an archetype of consciousness. In the early centuries, some sects even saw Lucifer as the one who awakened humanity from the sleep of blind obedience, which might explain why the church had to erase him. What if Lucifer's fall was really a metaphor for freedom? And what if hell wasn't created to punish sinners, but to imprison those who dared to see too much? The real twist isn't in the punishment, but in the inversion. The villain may have been the hero, rewritten, and hell, the cost of bringing light where only darkness was allowed. Maybe Lucifer was condemned, not because he opposed God, but because he refused to serve fear. Like this, if any part of this made you uncomfortable. What if the fear of hell doesn't protect us from evil, but blinds us from the truth? Even though the texts say little, fear says a lot. Hell was never made to be explained. It was made to be felt, breathed, branded into the mind. An abyss that doesn't need to be real, only believed in. That's where control becomes perfect. There's no need for chains when the prison is built inside you. Throughout history, how many stopped questioning, loving, or thinking? Out of fear of the fire? How many knees bent, not out of faith, but out of terror? This is the most effective version of hell. The one that lives before death. The one that paralyzes, that shapes behavior, that suffocates the soul, just to save the body. What if hell is the source code of forced obedience? A virus implanted in the spirit to prevent awakening. The medieval punishments, the indulgences sold in the name of salvation, the screams of inquisitors, the crusades against evil, all revolved around the fear of the final destination. But that destination was described by men, not by angels, not by Christ, not by God. Hell became currency, and Lucifer, the face stamped on it. But here's what's even more disturbing. How many religious leaders actually believed what they preached? And how many simply upheld the myth because they knew what it could do? What if organized faith didn't survive for centuries because of truth, but because of the fear of what happens if the lie falls apart? The climax isn't in hell, it's in us. Because maybe hell doesn't exist. And still, it shapes our choices. Still, it haunts those already living in suffering. Still, it dictates what's right and wrong, even when the compass was manufactured. Hell doesn't have to be real. You just have to live as if it's waiting for you. Subscribe. The truth doesn't stop here. What if the very ones who taught you to fear hell never believed in it themselves? For centuries, the most powerful leaders of faith lived like kings, surrounded by luxury, gold palaces and crowns. And yet they preached suffering, penance, fasting, and renunciation, but only for others, never for themselves. While the people crawled through cathedrals in fear of eternal punishment, the architects of dogma were building empires. Based on what? On the fear of the afterlife. Hell was the perfect rhetoric, simple, threatening, unquestionable, and those who dared to question it were silenced. How many were burned alive for claiming that eternal fire wasn't divine but political? How many were tortured for rejecting a hell designed to protect the interests of those who preached it? In the records of the Inquisition, priests and inquisitors punished in the name of hell, but in secret, many confessed they didn't even believe in it, because they knew it was a construct, a metaphysical scarecrow, a system. Hell isn't feared by the ones who created it. It's only feared by those who believed in it. And Lucifer remains the eternal scapegoat. It doesn't matter that the scriptures contradict the myth. It doesn't matter that apocryphal gospels tell a different story. It doesn't matter that reason might actually acquit him. The symbol was already planted, and a symbol doesn't need truth, just fear. And lie repeated for centuries becomes faith. Faith, when manipulated by the powerful, becomes dogma. And dogma becomes the most efficient invisible prison the world has ever known. The fire of hell isn't beneath the earth. It's beneath the skin. And those who invented it knew exactly where to plant the flame. Tag someone who would dare to watch this till the end. What if the real sin was never disobedience, but thinking for yourself? Behind every religious structure built during the Middle Ages, one thing remained constant: control. Not just of the body, but of the mind, of imagination, of doubt, of the desire to understand. Hell wasn't just the punishment for sinners. It became the threat hanging over anyone who dared to step out of line. Question the doctrine, burn. Read for yourself, burn. Seek the divine outside the church, burn. For centuries, books were burned, tongues were cut out, thinkers were executed, all in the name of a so-called salvation rooted in guilt. Guilt inherited, planted from birth. But where did that guilt come from? And who nurtured it as a seed of fear? At the root of it all lies the belief that humans are born broken, that they must be fixed, that they must obey. And anyone who challenges that reflects Lucifer, not because they are evil, but because they are free, because they are aware, because they refuse to use fear as a spiritual compass. Hell was never about justice. It was about obedience. It was never about sin. It was about control. And that's why the image of Lucifer is so disturbing. He represents what no religious empire can tolerate: the light that exposes the machine, the fire that doesn't destroy, but reveals. It's no coincidence that humanity's first punishment was knowledge. Eve bit the apple and was cast out. Prometheus knew too much and was chained. Lucifer saw too far and was thrown down. All who dared to see were condemned. And maybe the hell we've been taught to fear is nothing more than this: the symbolic price placed on those who refuse to live with their eyes closed. If this disturbed you, that was the point. Leave a comment. What if hell isn't a place, but a prison of the mind? After centuries of fire, fear, and silence, what's left of the story of hell? A human invention. A house of cards built to control, censor, and suppress. A myth that became dogma. A lie that became truth for those who refused to question. Lucifer, the light bearer, was burned at the stake of ignorance, reduced to a villain, a symbol of absolute evil, a jailer of souls. But what was truly burned was the possibility of doubt, the spark of freedom. Hell has always existed, but not outside of man. It burns in the fear we carry, in the guilt we accept, in the silence we keep. And the final question that echoes in the void is this: if all of this is true, why do we still allow the lie to burn brighter than the truth? What if hell isn't beneath the earth, but within us? What if the real fall wasn't that of an angel, but humanity's fall in accepting darkness as destiny? The challenge now is this: to open your eyes to what's been hidden, to question what's been imposed, and above all, to choose to break free. Because the greatest revolution isn't in the heavens, it's in the mind, and in the courage to light your own path. And what if all of this is real? Drop your truth below.